Okay, let me talk very briefly about our position. We believe that the Bible is true from cover to cover, and this is the position we start from. And we never try to prove the Bible is correct. We believe it's correct. We assume it's correct. We start from this belief, and the information that I'm sharing with you is just in order that we may think about a world in a way which is compatible both with science and with the Bible. So let's talk very briefly and very quickly about the flood. This is going to be a rapid-fire succession of slides. I'll give you just some hints of what we think about the flood. But let's start thinking about the Earth's crust. We know today that the crust of the Earth is broken into dozens of pieces. Some of those pieces are very large, others are very small, but actually scientists do not have absolute clarity about how many pieces are there and where the boundaries are. So the whole thing is very fluid and quite uncertain when it comes to smaller plates. Those plates move on the surface of the Earth. In some places, they move away from each other. In other places, they dive under each other, and so forth. And they supposedly move because they are dragged by currents that exist in the matter inside the Earth. But many people realize that this mechanism is very insufficient and very inadequate to explain the movements of massive continents. Therefore, they are looking for alternative explanations. I will show you a very short video filmed in Hawaii. You're going to see a crater of one of the volcanoes, and you will see something which can be an illustration of how the plates move on the surface of the Earth. Molten material rises on the farther side of the lake, and it flows down to the nearer side to the right, and you see something like plates which form on top of this molten lava. These parts, the top parts, are darker because they are colder. Okay, so it's believed that modern continents were once a single continent that's called Pangaea. It's believed that there were other continents before that, other supercontinents, but the Pangaea is the most recent one, which existed supposedly 225 million years ago. And then that Pangaea broke up into pieces, and those pieces moved apart from each other slowly and gradually for 225 million years, and this is where we are right now. But let's start with a very simple question. Did God create a broken earth? I do not know about your children or about yourself, but my children would not want to have a broken iPhone. When God looked at the earth, at the world He was creating during the week of creation, He called almost every act of creation but simply good. But in the end of the sixth day, God looked at everything He created, and He said that it was very good. But because the earth is broken, because we have the crust of the earth which is broken into pieces, we have volcanoes, because volcanoes are places where magma, molten rocks, arise to the surface, and eruptions happen which kill thousands of people. Thousands of people die every year in different parts of the earth. For example, these are the victims, some of the victims of the volcanic eruption in AD 79. These are people who died in the city of Pompeii. earthquakes happen because the earth is broken into pieces. The great earthquake in San Francisco in 1906 devastated the city, caused lots of damage. Lots of property was lost. Because the Earth's crust is broken into pieces, tsunamis happen. Tsunamis are typically generated by earthquakes. This tsunami in 2011 in Japan was generated by a huge earthquake which took place not far from the coast of Japan. Countless dozens of thousands of lives were lost. The tsunami caused great damage. And if we observe the patterns, we will notice that the greatest tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions take place along what is called the Pacific Ring of Fire. Let's again go back to the Bible and think about this idea of Pangea, of one supercontinent. Is it biblical? In Genesis 1:9, God causes parts of the land rise up, waters gather together in one place, the Bible says. So if the waters were in one place, it's reasonable to assume that the land also could have been in one place. Therefore, the idea of the existence of Pangea supercontinent, it does not contradict the Bible. But can we really fit the continents together like pieces of jigsaw puzzle? Before we try to put the continents together, let's talk about the continental shelf, because the continental shelf is a concept which is very closely related to the concept of the continental edge. Normally when we see blue on maps and globes, we see the surface of oceans, of the seas and other big bodies of water or just rivers. But on these maps I'm going to show you, and already am showing you, the blue shows the land which lies underwater. So there is no water on this map. And if you look at the Gulf of Mexico, to the right you see the Florida. That's where I come from currently. Maybe I'll be coming from a different place several years from now. I do not know, you never know. So if you look at the Florida, to the left, that is to the west from Florida, you can see a wide band of blue. And that blue is actually a part of the peninsula which is submerged, which is underwater. So the peninsula actually is much wider than it appears if we look at the modern coastlines. But the part of that peninsula is underwater. So what is the continental shelf? Continental shelf is the continental margin which is underwater. So the land goes down to the sea level, but it does not end where the land meets water today. The continent continues under the water, but the water is very shallow until we reach the end of the continent, the edge of the continent, and there the depth increases very rapidly. This is why this submerged margin of the continents is called the continental shelf. So why are we talking about the shelf? Because if we want to see how the continents fit together or how they do not fit together, we have to look at the edges of the continents, that is, at the continental shelves. But before we go on, let's pay a little attention to a little river in the States which is called the Mississippi. The Mississippi has several nicknames, and one of those nicknames is the Big Muddy, because it carries tons and tons of mud into the Gulf of Mexico every hour of the year. And it was back in the 19th century when some people became interested in the amount of mud which accumulated in the Gulf of Mexico next to the edge of the continent near the mouth of the Mississippi River. And some estimates were made the volume of that heap of mud, which is called the Mississippi Cone on the map. The volume of that mud was measured. Then the speed with which mud is carried into the Gulf of Mexico was also measured. And it turned out that the amount of mud which we can see there would have accumulated there in only 4,500 years, if the mud was accumulating at the same rate as today. So sometimes we are taught that the present is the key to the past. We can know the past history of the earth if we look at the processes which operate today on the earth. So we took a look at this process, that is, they took a good look at that process, and they understood that this is a clock. This is a good clock. This process goes on year by year. The mud accumulates. We can determine the speed of the mud accumulation, the rate of the mud accumulation. We can determine the volume of that mud in the Gulf of Mexico, and we can divide the total amount of mud by the amount that is carried by the river every year, and we can get an estimate of how old the Mississippi River is. So it turns out that that mud has been accumulating there only for 4,500 years. Do you remember an event in the Bible which took place about 4,500 years ago, which may have produced new continents, new mountains, and new rivers? Yes, of course, that's the flood of Noah. If we look a little down south, if we look at northern Brazil, we will see that the Amazon River also carries out lots of mud into the Atlantic Ocean. But if we look at the mud which was accumulated near the mouth of the Amazon River, we will see that it was also accumulating here for only thousands of years, not millions. So there was probably no Amazon just several thousand years ago. And the same picture we see near the mouths of all the great rivers of the world. And if we look at the Atlantic as a whole, we will see that, continents seem to have similar edges across the Atlantic. We will skip this. This is the map of the world without water. Probably you have seen some cracks at the bottom of the oceans. Have you? Do you see cracks? In the Atlantic, coming from the Atlantic, joining a similar crack in the Indian Ocean. Then from the Indian Ocean, the crack goes between Australia and the Antarctica. It goes through the southern Pacific and goes to the Baja in Mexico. And also we can see that the Pacific and the Atlantic are very different. The Pacific has less volcanoes. The Pacific has less wrinkles. I was talking about the Atlantic. It has less wrinkles, it has less volcanoes, but if we look at the Pacific, and especially at the Western Pacific, we see that there are many volcanoes, there are lava flows which cover the whole floor of the Pacific Ocean. We see trenches, lots of wrinkles. Obviously, that's a piece of land which was disturbed greatly in the past. And these two oceans are very, very different. But let's look at a standard attempt to fit the continents together. It was suggested by Edward Bullard and his colleagues in 1965. And it looks like the continents across the Atlantic may be fitted together as pieces of a puzzle. But there are some problems. First of all, if you look at South America, down left-hand corner, and Africa, down right-hand corner, they are depicted as having approximately the same area. But if we look at the figures, we will see that their areas are very different. Africa's area is nearing 12 million square miles, while South America's area is almost 7 million square miles. So they are depicted as having the same area, the same size, but in reality they are very different. Why was this done? Maybe to get an easier and nicer fit, I do not know. Then Central America is missing, southern Mexico, the Caribbean islands are missing, and the continents are rotated relative to each other. But that's not a big problem, I think, rotation. If the continents were moving on the Earth, they may have been rotated. But let's look at a model which attempts to join the continents across the Atlantic on a globe, not on a flat map, but on a globe. And if we have South America, Central America, and Northern America attached to each other, if we keep Africa and Europe together and we try to put them together as pieces of a puzzle on a globe, the fit isn't that good as it turns. But if we try to fit the continents on the globe to the base of the crack, that looks really well. I think you will agree. So what is that crack? Actually, that crack, or that system of cracks which encircles the whole globe, is the longest in the world range of mountains. That's the longest in the world system of mountain ranges, and many people have no idea that those mountains even exist, because they are hidden under the ocean. So the continents seem to fit the base of those underwater mountains. So are there any clues in the Bible that can explain to us how and when the earth was broken? In Genesis 7:11, we are told that the flood started when Noah was 600 years old. Was he old, you said? Well, after the flood, he lived 350 years more. 600, 350. So Noah actually lived 950 years. So when the flood started, he was not an old man. He was pretty much like me. I'm 45. If the Lord is willing and I will be still alive, I will live up to 85. But you see, 85 and 45, I'm not yet an old man. Even though you may think differently, I know that. So the flood started when Noah was 600 years old, and the Bible tells us that people lived much longer lives before the flood. That's a subject of a different discussion. We will not go into that right now. But can you remember what was the first physical event which became the start of the flood? Rain. He said rain. The fountains. So basically one person said that the water came from above first. It was rain first. And the other person said that fountains started working before the rain. So fountains, the water came from below first. No, don't think that you will embarrass him. You will not. You're just thinking together and you will see that when you think together, you will arrive at the correct conclusion. That's okay. So actually, if we read the second part of this verse, it says that, you see, the wife is the neck, while the husband is the head. That's a great wisdom which I've learned over the years of my married life from my Ukrainian wife. So, the Bible says that the flood started when the fountains of the great deep, that is of the ocean or the seas, or maybe the subterranean, under the earth ocean, they broke up or burst open, and only then the windows of heaven are mentioned. The description of the flood given in the Bible, it's not poetic, it's not an allegory. We take it as real history, as a chronology of the flood. And when God used his people to write chronological books, he normally described things which happened first. He described them first, and then he mentioned the things which took place after that. So not probably, but certainly the waters first came from below, and maybe the fountains and the windows are related. Maybe there is a cause and effect here. Was the flood local? We will not talk about the scientific view on that issue. We will talk about the biblical teaching of the flood. First of all, waters covered all the mountains that existed before the flood. I will stress the mountains which existed before the flood, because the mountains that we have on the earth today, some of them, the majority of them, are new mountains which did not exist before the flood. So the mountains on the pre-flood earth were completely covered. The event, the catastrophe, lasted 1 year. So it's too much for a localized flood. Then, if the flood was local, why building the ark? The ark is absolutely unnecessary. When the Lord wanted to preserve Lot and his family, he told them, move. When the Lord wanted to preserve Israel and his family, he said, move. But he didn't say move to Noah and his family. He said, build the ark, because there was nowhere to move. Right now, many people are trying to move to Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Arkansas. There was no Arkansas safe enough back then to move to. So they had to build the ark. Again, they had to take all the birds. They had to take all the animals, all kinds of animals and all kinds of birds. But the number of birds and animals were far lower than you might think. Creationists right now think that Noah had somewhere between 3 and 16, 17,000 animals on the ark only. From 3,000 to 17,000. Not millions, only thousands of animals. So why take the animals into the ark? Okay, the animals are killed off in a local area, but the animals from outside that devastated area would come back and repopulate it. Why take the birds into the ark? Some birds can fly dozens of kilometers a day, per day, and they can do that for a week, for 10 days. Birds would be able to escape from the devastated area, except along the edges of it. So it was not necessary to take the birds into the ark if there were safe places where the birds could fly to. The main purpose of the flood was to destroy all humans and all flesh from under heaven. I think the heaven wraps the earth all around the globe. So this is definitely a global language, not a local language. Then Genesis says that all humans, animals, and birds outside the ark died. None of them escaped. The earth was repopulated by the survivors of the flood. The Bible expressly says that all humans in the world today are the descendants of Noah's sons and their wives, of course. The seasons were disrupted during the flood. When God talks about the flood, when he reasons with himself, he says, no, never, ever will I send another global flood, and sowing and reaping, day and night, winter and summer will ever cease on the earth. So that's again global language. That's a global planetary catastrophe which even disrupted the seasons during the flood. And God promised to never send another global flood. You know, if we think that the flood was local, as even some Christian professors think in Bible seminaries, in Bible institutes, it means that the rainbow which God gave as a sign of his covenant with the earth, that he would never send another global flood. If that rainbow is not a sign of that a global flood will never take place, then what God was talking about? There were lots of localized floods since then, and rainbow is about nothing. So there are two major scientific theories which attempt to describe the flood. If you talk to the most orthodox creation scientists today, if you hear the advice of the creation ministries which feature the largest numbers of PhD geologists and biologists and geophysicists in the world today, they will tell you that the correct theory, or the one which appears to be a more correct theory, is called the catastrophic plate tectonics. We started with usual secular plate tectonics. The Earth's crust is broken into pieces, the pieces move, collide, spread apart, and so forth. It is happening over millions of years. That's the secular plate tectonics. And according to secular plate tectonics, the Earth the Earth's crust was broken into pieces almost for all ages, if we look back, for billions of years. So brokenness, according to this secular plate tectonic theory, is a normal state of the Earth. But the catastrophic plate tectonics believes that the crust, the one single supercontinent, was broken into pieces because of the flood, during the flood. And then the continents moved away from each other at incredible speeds, and basically the catastrophic plate tectonics is the same plate tectonics, but the breakup happened during the flood, and the processes were sped up millions of times, hundreds of millions of times. But I personally prefer, this is not my educated opinion, this is my prejudiced, bigoted, unscientific, all sorts of disclaimers, opinion about this theory. I like it. I'll tell you about a different theory, and this theory has a significant following, not among geologists, but among engineers, because from an engineering standpoint, it works really well. The author of this theory is a mechanical engineer himself. His name is Dr. Walt Brown. He received his PhD, I think it was at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, MIT. That's one of the leading schools which teaches mechanical engineers in the world. That's a top-notch school, and he began his life as an evolutionist. He believed in the evolutionary worldview, but then he changed